Look, I must compliment you as a group of being very attentive. Normally at this time of day, it's pretty hard to get everyone's attention, but you've been a very attentive group. So our next speaker is very lucky in that respect, Christine. Also on the tables you will see our environmental scan for 2013. There will be a launch for that later on, but you're more than happy to take that with you, and it will be published on our web later on. But there's a lot of good information in that about all our industries. Now I'd like to introduce Christine Haines. Christine is the Director of Miles Morgan Australia, a company that offers research and evaluation services in the areas of vocational education, training and workforce development. We know Christine. She's been a major player in the industry, the vet industry, for a long time. She's worked with us for over a decade. During the time which she has worked, she's worked at different ways to helping make the EOS suite of training products and training packages more accessible and responsive to the needs of a more diverse group of learners and employees. Thanks very much, Christine.
Two things, I guess, to start with. One, I obviously haven't done a very good job over the last decade, having listened to the concerns that people have expressed today. And secondly, this is an awful gig to have after afternoon tea at 3:30. But nonetheless, I'll attempt to talk to you today about this community of people that are sitting in front of us, the beginnings of a network of women within the industry, and why it's vitally important to gain support for it from both women within the industry and their employers. What I'd like to do is just talk about it in these three brief areas. One, I'd like to provide some background to the establishment of what I'll call a network from now on. It's a community of women that have been drawn together specifically today, but hopefully with a more sustainable future than that. I'd like to talk about what I see its immediate focus and its particular first initiative, which is a related workplace English language and literacy project that EEOS is conducting. And finally, I'd like to just sum up by reiterating some of the things that have been said today about, an established network and the possible contributions such a network could make into the future. And as I say, much of that will be summing up, reiterating many of the things that have already been said. So in terms of background, as part of the training package endorsement process, as many of you who work in the vet sector would be well aware, EOS is required to submit a number of quality reports each time it goes forward with a new or revised training package. There's a holistic report that deals with the overall quality of the package, and from where I come in, there's also an equity report that assures the National Skills Standards Council and previously the National Quality Council that the design and content of the package has taken into account a number of access and equity issues. That assessment is made against a set of quality principles, and essentially those principles are whether it's responsive to the needs of a contemporary industry sector, whether it promotes recognition of an individual's competence across industry sectors, so whether it promotes mobility, whether it's flexible and supports equitable access and progression, multiple entry and exit points, and whether it is actually functional, whether it's easy to understand, clearly written, and is able to be implemented across a range of settings, given the diversity of settings in which people will be both learning and being assessed. So I've tried to simplify, but in essence, they're the sort of questions, and that is a very quick simplification of the sort of things. Is there evidence, for example, that I look for that the consultation and validation processes have included underrepresented groups? And even if it has any consideration been given to their advice? Do training package components meet the diversity of enterprise and individual needs? Is the package flexible or rigid and therefore not open to the changing requirements of industry and individual? Are units of competency and assessment requirements clearly written? Because that, again, is an important access and equity issue, depending on where you're learning. And are assessments fair and reasonable? That's it in a nutshell. Well, in writing that report, and I have done many of them, about 18 months ago, I actually spoke to the senior EEOS management team, or part thereof, and actually said that I could no longer suggest that there were plans afoot for the industry to be more inclusive of women in its design. I'm only talking about this, its design of training qualifications and products, without some evidence of them speeding up the program, because from my perspective, whenever I walked into a forum, this is what I was confronted with. So, in the meantime, so that was one part of the background to it. In the meantime, EOS had actually started looking at the language literacy and numeracy requirements of its training packages. With the introduction of the core skills of learning, reading, writing, oral communication and numeracy, they started to look very closely at those that were inherent or embedded within units of competency already across a range of qualifications. What EOS found was that the core skill levels that were implicit requirements in existing units of competence were quite high relative to other entry-level qualifications at the same AQF level, and that this was especially the case regarding the core skill of numeracy. So somebody rather cleverly within EEOS put these two issues together and came up with the idea of establishing a women's community network that would provide a mechanism to deal with both issues. A women's network could address the need to have a consultative mechanism that ensures that women's voices or perspectives would be heard when important decisions about training are made. And we all know the rhetoric around the vocational education and training sector being an industry-led sector. But it's very hard to have a demand-led training system that is being largely shaped by the voices of men. One of its first activities would be to ensure that women are equipped with the core skills of learning, reading, writing, oral communication, and especially numeracy, if they were to have a chance of moving into and succeeding in the industry. So the network, in essence, was initially conceived of as a central point for dialogue and research on training issues that women were likely to encounter in the industry. And they've all been raised throughout the day today. So therefore, it's really the network for me, and I'm only talking from my own perspective, is, and its continuation and your continued support for it and your encouragement for your employers' support for it, is that it provides a mechanism to be part of the consultative forums that actually shape the vocational education and training policies and products for this sector. And that's an important, somebody else talked about the importance of policies and systems affecting change. And so that's a really important mechanism. Secondly, it has the potential, as I see it, to be a particularly important forum for providing advice on the sorts of resources that might be developed through the well-funded strategic project that I mentioned earlier that's looking at the resources around language literacy and numeracy that might assist women into the industry sector. But I think while these issues are vitally important, and I encourage you to go back and to fight to go to the next national consultation meeting that's conducted by EOS, and if you get a phone call asking for your advice about the resources that might be that would have been helpful to you, that you willingly participate. I think there are other issues, and I should say I think they're really important stepping off points, because I think it's very important that the network has a concrete focus, because as you all have mentioned today, you belong to smaller communities, enterprises that have their own networks, and there has to be a motivation for coming together in a bigger network. I think there are issues that particularly related to women's employment that the network might also consider if it continues and is sustainable. One of the things that I think is vital, and again it's been reinforced all throughout the day, is the importance of the provision of support for women who work in the industry, in a predominantly male industry. When I've asked at the forums that I've attended of women at the annual conference, for example, what would be helpful, they have said that a network would be greatly appreciated. Networks are characterised, as you know, by a series of interconnected elements, and it's that interconnection that enables the energy and the power to flow. And for a long time, I think that the importance of that connectivity, such connectivity, has been recognised by men. Their old boys networks remain an influential force in workforces across the industry, across all industry sectors. Women, on the other hand, have been much slower to provide that support for one another. And yet, in many workforces, double standards remain. We all know that good leaders are expected to be strong, confident and assertive, yet when women behave in these ways, they're often perceived as being uncaring, self-promoting and aggressive even, all of which have very negative connotations. On the other hand, when women act more collaboratively, they're viewed as lacking in leadership skills because they compromise too readily. These issues are not particular to this industry, as somebody raised earlier. They're far more pervasive than that. And I thought about Dr. Fiona Wood, whom many of you would remember as the burns specialist who cared for the Bali bombing victims, and she was the Australian of the Year some years back. She recently revealed that her toughest critics were not men, but women. It was women who were most critical and unsupportive of her choice to be both a surgeon and to mother 5 children at the same time, and were most critical of her capacities as a mother. She is, by the way, married to an equally eminent surgeon, and I doubt very much whether he has been asked about his capacity to act as a surgeon and to father his same 5 children very often. So I think we've got a lot to learn from men in terms of the way they use their networks to support one another. One of the other things that's been talked about a lot, so I probably won't go over it terribly much, but just to suggest that the network, I think, also has the potential to take a far more active role at an industry level in attracting more women into the industry. And we've all looked at the stats, so I'm not going to go on and talk about that. But I think one of the important things about those stats is that they haven't shifted. So back in 2006, Frances Regan from the National Electrical and Communications Association was given widespread coverage, press coverage, because of the abysmal 7% of women overall, not in the trades, but overall in electrotechnology. Prue Goward in New South Wales has recently come out, and you actually quoted some of those stats today that she's been also using about that figure just hasn't shifted. And when that figure doesn't shift, importantly, we won't ever close the gender wage gap so long as we have a segregated workforce and where people are not continue to go into gender-specific roles. And as somebody who literally, as probably the oldest person in the room here today, came out on unequal pay with my male colleagues who had exactly the same qualification and went into exactly the same industry, and I was only entitled to 80%, I am very keen to see the gender wage gap disappear. And it's, as I say, it's only going to be by breaking down our perceptions about what's men's work and what's women's work. So I think the network has an important part to play in steering girls at an early age, as Bob talked about earlier today, into and sparking their interest in science and technology studies, maths studies and careers. And its first initiative in developing these resources that support young women to develop the foundation skills necessary for a career in the the energy sector is a really good example of that. And as you know, the language of the sector provides great marketing, branding opportunities. I mean, really, they are just so clever and catchy. I'm not so sure about this one, however. But catchy slogans are not enough. Research shows how important it is for people to see people just like themselves performing particular roles in order to be able to imagine themselves in such a role. And people just like themselves, not only in terms of gender, but in terms of race, family background, and social class. The research also consistently shows that one-on-one relationships and role models have a very powerful role in influencing young people's learning and work choices. You, in fact, the women who've spoken to us today, are living proof that women do succeed in technological fields. The stereotype's still out there, but look, there's a woman who's succeeding, and that means it's possible for me to succeed. So a really important part of this network's purpose could be to increase women's representation in this industry sector. If we look further afield, however, I think we can see that access to energy is a very significant women's issue. For example, the electrification of remote villages in Pakistan provides us with a really good example of this. In the late 1980s, an aid agency found villages that were off the grid, where light came from pine wood torches and kerosene lights. They responded by introducing micro hydroelectric technology using water from the region's rivers to generate energy. The outcomes for women have actually been profound. Gone, and I quote, "Gone is the drudgery of time-consuming household chores, such as washing clothes and churning butter by hand. Eye and respiratory diseases from kerosene and pinewood torches have declined, especially amongst women who spend much of their time at home. Electric light enables women to spend more time turning the local wool into products that form their largest source of income. And television, through the Open University in Pakistan, has opened up education for women, where a strict culture of concealing women from men confines them to their village boundary." And finally, as you're all aware, the energy sector itself is at a significant point in its history, and a strong women's network has the capacity to influence by offering a perspective that may be more slightly focused on the needs of women. Inventing a sustainable energy future represents the defining challenge of our time, and it's really important that we use the skills and experiences of women to progress further and faster towards a cleaner energy future. So from my perspective, the purposes of the network range from the immediate and quite fundamental purposes through to contributing to some of the most significant issues of our time. And I urge you to become active participants and to participate in ways that ensure that this community that's been brought together today is sustained. And finally, I'd like to finish by reminding you of an Australian woman who was born in 1890, whose remarkable story is little known, despite the fact that she distinguished herself in technical fields and opened doors for countless other women. She set up her own electrical contracting business in 1918, and she actually apprenticed herself to it in order to meet the requirements of gaining a diploma in electrical engineering at Sydney Technical College. Florence Violet Mackenzie, Mrs. Mac as she was known, was the first female electrical engineer in Australia and the first female amateur radio operator. She took out her licence in 1922. She's best known for her work during the Second World War. Having founded the Women's Emergency Signalling Corps in 1939, she campaigned to have some of her female trainees accepted into the Royal Navy, thereby originating the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service. During the war, she actually trained 12,000 servicemen who went through her Morse code training school. But importantly, for this occasion, in 1934, she actually established the Electrical Association for Women, a non-profit organisation that provided for women's electrical needs, because she was a strong believer that electricity had the potential to remove the drudgery from women's lives. Women could become members of the association for a modest annual subscription, use the club rooms in Clarence Street in Sydney, attend lectures and excursions, and receive advice on all electrical matters, and have their appliances tested for safety. Keen to see women benefit from their access to electricity, alongside corresponding with Albert Einstein, she also, in 1936, wrote the first all-electric cookbook. So I think there is no doubt that you walk in what look like very modest, but are in fact very large footsteps. Thank you.